In this video, I will show you how you can use Crosser to get machine data into AVEVA Insight in the cloud. So a flow like this would typically run on a Crosser node installed locally in the on-premise environment where you can get access to the OPC server that we're using in this case. We could have used other machine connectors like PLC modules. The flow will work the same, but I chose to use an OPC input module here for this example. So the flow will typically run in the local environment, collect the data from local machines, and then send it to the Insight cloud service. So we will take a look at how we can get from the machine data, restructure the data so that it matches what is needed by AVEVA, and then send it off to AVEVA using the final module in this flow. So we're using an OPC server as an example, but that would of course have been other types of input modules that would work the same. But when reading data from an OPC server like we do here, we need to tell the module when we want to read data. So I'm starting this flow by a trigger module that generates a trigger every second. So every second we will request new values for the tags or node IDs that we want to get from the OPC server. And that is configured on this OPC module. So here you can either enter node IDs directly in the settings of this module, or more conveniently, if you have a large number of node IDs or tags you want to read, you can upload a JSON file with a list of node IDs that you want to get from the OPC server. Now for this demo, I kept it small, so we're just reading 4 tags to make it easier to see what is happening. But the flow will work exactly the same, independent of the number of tags that we read from the OPC server. So let's take a look at what this data looks like. So if I open up the debug window on the right-hand side, we can see what we get from the OPC server. So whenever we request this module to read data from the OPC server, we will receive a list of tags that we have, or node IDs that we have read from that server, where we have a name of the tag, we have a value, we have a timestamp, and some other information that we get from the server that is associated with this specific tag. So we get a list of these. In this case, there are 4 of these in this list since I requested 4 tags to be read from the server. But in order to send this to Insight, we need to restructure this data a little bit. So when sending data to Insight, you have 2 options. You can either upload data in CSV format or in JSON format. And I've chosen JSON format here because it's a little bit easier to see what it looks like. But you can also use CSV format with Crosser if you want. So here we're using JSON. So if you look at the final module here before the output, we can see what we need to create. So Insight expects to get an array of objects where each object has one required parameter, which is a timestamp, and it needs to be called datetime. And then there can be one or several tag values where the tag name is the property name, and then the associated value with that tag. So that is how we can upload data into Insight. And then you can, in a single request, you can send either one measurement for all the tags, or you can send multiple measurements, depending on what you prefer based on efficiency and latency and so forth. You can decide to send individual measurements or collect a large number of measurements and upload them in a single request to AVEVA. By just reconfiguring this final module that collects a number of these measurements that we get from the OPC server. So right now I've configured it to collect 2 measurements, and that's why we have 2 in this list, and they have different timestamps, but you can configure it for either another number of measurements, or you can set it up to collect data over a specified time period. So you have full flexibility in deciding how much data and when you want to upload it into Insight. So then the question is how we get from this data that we had from the OPC server into this data. And we do that by using these 2 modules that we have in front here. So with the first module, we take this array of data we get from the OPC server and just use the name and value that we get for each tag, and we combine them into one key value pair with the tag name and then the associated value. So this first module will create these 4 measurements that we have down here, and then the second module adds a timestamp, and this is the current timestamp when we run the flow, and we assign that to this predefined property that Insight is expecting. So that is the output that we get at this point, and then the final module will just collect a number of these into an array, and then we have we have data in a format that can be sent to Insight using this output module that will publish data into Insight using an HTTP call. So this is one way how we can send data to Insight. This is the most compact format that you can use, where you combine multiple tags into a single object. The drawback with this one is that all these values are now assigned the same timestamp. And as you might recall, if we go back to the OPC data, we had individual timestamps for each of the tags, and this doesn't have to be the same. This is when the data was updated in the OPC server. So that could have been at another time than when we actually requested the data from this module. So if we want to keep those timestamps that we get from the OPC server, then we have to create an individual object for each of the tags and assign individual timestamps. And that is the second alternative, which is the lower path here. So in a real use case, you would use one of these two, but to make it easier to show it here, I put them both into the same flow. So more or less a similar process, but we do it in a slightly different order. So instead of starting by combining the data that we needed for the tags for the whole array, we start by looping over the array so that we can process each individual tag. And then in the next module, we combine the name and the value into the format that we want. And then we also move the timestamp that we get from the OPC server into this, or change the name of that property into the predefined name that AVEVA expects. So then we get a result that looks like this. So now we have an individual object for each tag with its own timestamp. So now we're using the timestamp that we get from the OPC server instead of assigning a new timestamp when data arrives into this flow. So then we can keep the original or source timestamp from the OPC server at the cost that you get a slightly more verbose format that you need to send to AVEVA. In the same way, we can collect any number of measurements here. So in this case, we have the same set of 2 measurements, where the first set, they actually get the same timestamp from the OPC server, and then you have another set of measurements at the bottom with another timestamp. But again, you can configure this module to collect any number or collect data over any time frame that you want before sending the data into Insight. So this is a simple way of getting data from your local machines or other types of data sources into Insight. Thanks for watching.